So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. It's great to see you here. We're happy that you joined us from wherever you are. It's the start of Yale's fall semester this week, and it's really a nice, beautiful day here. And I hope it's beautiful where you are too. My name is Gary Dunning, and I'm the executive director of the Forest School here at the Yale School of the Environment. I also direct the Forest Dialogue, a program here. They're both based here in New Haven. I'll be one of your facilitators for this series, and I'm giving today's introduction for the webinar. Of course, you're tuned in to the Yale Forest Forum. This is the first webinar in part 2 of our series on the history of people, forests, and forestry, where part 1 focused on traditional and indigenous forest practice. This part 2 will examine the history of what's coined as scientific forestry, with its origins in early industrial Europe and its spread throughout the globe. First part focusing more on Europe, and the second part of the series will look at its impact in other places, particularly in the US. It's great to see so many of you here. I hope most of you were able to attend the first part. That happened in the spring of this year. If you weren't able to see it, just note that all of those webinars and every webinar previously is available on the Yale Forest Forum website. So just go to the Yale Forest Forum website and click down through the series you're interested in, and you will see that each speaker recording is available. So I'm really excited about this second part of the series. And I think it's going to be a really fun and educational 4 months ahead. I also need to mention that there is another Yale Forest Forum webinar series happening this fall. The focus of that series is on the frontiers of forest carbon crediting. So very different series and different focus from this one on history. That series takes place on Tuesdays, but at the same time from 12 to 1 on Tuesdays through this semester. And it's very easy, just like this one, to register for that one. Just go to the Yale Forest Forum website and you'll see the link. So I want to talk a little bit, particularly those that are new to the Yale Forest Forum, I want to give you just an extremely brief history of what the Yale Forest Forum is. It was founded in 1994 by Professor John Gordon as a platform to bring together forest stakeholders in an effort to create a shared vision for the future of the US forests. It's evolved and grown over the years, past 30 years really, but it is and will always remain focused on bringing people together to discuss forest issues. The Yale Forest Forum, YFF, is currently the special events hub of the Forest School here at Yale. It serves the full Yale community and far beyond, as witnessed by you all joining us. It's our forum for engagement, learning, and discussion on pressing forest topics and challenges. To date, we've had 13 different Yale Forest Forum webinar series. We started them in 2020, and they've covered a lot of different topics. You can see one of the publications that came out of it, YFF Review, is there on the screen. There's many others, and I encourage you, again, to check out previous publications and presentations, all available on the Yale Forest Forum website. Now to focus on this part 2 series of the history of forest people and forestry. This series is going to be co-hosted by the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment. And I'm happy to welcome back the Forest History Society as sponsors of the spring series. They're back with us again. And a previous host of a series on mature and old-growth forests, the Society of American Foresters, is also co-hosting the series. And we have our newest co-host joining us, the University of Minnesota. So let me talk a little bit about your facilitators for this series. First is Terry Baker. Terry is the CEO of the Society of American Foresters. Terry's previously, as I mentioned, co-facilitated the series on mature and old-growth forests. We're really happy to be working with Terry and SAF again. And I should note that this year is SAF's 125th anniversary. So again, our focus on history, working with SAF, is also in recognition of their anniversary. Our second co-facilitator for the series is Mike Dockery, Dr. Mike Dockery. Mike is the Associate Professor of Forest Resources at the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota. I want to ask Mike, and I don't know if I've asked him to do this. Mike, if you want to take a second to welcome the audience, please jump on.
Sure. Welcome, everyone. Bonjour, this is Mike Dockery. I work with tribal natural resources and teach and research around that topic, ensuring that tribal values are expressed in land management. I'm really excited to be here for this focus on forest history and played a big part last year in the seminar with the indigenous and tribal forestry. I'm just really looking forward to hearing all of our presenters this year or this semester. Thank you. Miigwech.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. And again, thanks for joining us. And for folks that are interested, Mike will be one of our presenters later in the series, and we'll talk more about that later. And our final and returning co-facilitator is Dr. Tanya Muntz. Tanya is president and CEO of the Forest History Society based in Durham, North Carolina in the US. Tanya co-facilitated, as mentioned, last spring series on the history of people, forest, and forestry. Hi again, Tanya. Any thoughts you want to share on the series for this fall?
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much, Gary, and welcome and thanks to everybody for joining us. Just a couple of words. The Forest History Society is delighted to be doing this again with the EL Forest Forum. We're a library and archive dedicated to forest and conservation history. So happy birthday to both SAF and also to the Yale School of the Environment on their 125th anniversary. That's exactly the kind of thing we care about. Our archives hold documents on human interactions with forests from private companies like the Weyerhaeuser Company records to organizations. We have the SAF collections in-house. We have an American Forests collections to Forest Reference Collection or Forest Service Reference Collection, and then lots of papers by individuals who are really critical to forest and conservation history. I think what I'm most excited about for this webinar is that we are going to be hearing from scholars who span the early modern period to really about the 1970s. And I think this seminar really makes the point, and this is what Forest History Society believes in as well, that understanding how humans have interacted with forests and natural resources provides really important context to the decisions we make today and the kinds of forest stewards that we are into the future. So I think we're in for a real treat, and I'm excited to be learning with all of you over the next few weeks. So thanks, and back to you, Gary.
Awesome. Thanks, Tanya. And it's great to work with you again on this. And I'm looking forward to it. So as Tanya mentioned, it is not only SAF's 125th anniversary, but it's also the Yale Forest School's 125th anniversary, as you can see by that logo. So that really is the reason that we felt it was really important to put this series together. Throughout the whole year, we have and will continue to share stories of the school and how it helped shape forestry and how forestry helped shape the school. And to be able to tell that story, we felt it was important to do this two-part series, one looking back, pre-industrial, and then this series in the fall looking at industrial and post-industrial development of scientific forestry. I won't go into it, but there's a third part of this series that will look at contemporary forestry and the future of forestry, and that will happen next spring. So again, that's the idea. We wanted just to make sure, yes, we will share thoughts about the Forest School's history, but this is really an exploration of the history of forestry. And now to talk about specifically this series, as you can see, we have a fantastic slate of themes and speakers lined up for you throughout the next 4 months. Note that we have just a couple slots still open for the speakers. We're talking to a few speakers, so those slots will be filled very shortly. Don't worry. But check back on the Yale Force Forum website to see who we've slotted in for those different talks. Again, really exciting, lots of awesome themes that we'll be covering. Now, quickly, series logistics. So the series convenes on Thursdays from 12 to 1 Eastern US time through the beginning of December. The webinar presentations will run roughly 30 minutes or so, and the audience Q&A will follow. Remember to submit your questions early. We get a lot of questions. The ones that are submitted early are more likely to be asked of the speaker, but we will endeavor to try to answer any of the questions that we can, even directly through the Q&A. So look out for that. And I think, as you all know, each session in the series will be recorded and available on Yale Force Forum's website shortly after the session, as well as, when we get permission, as well as the PowerPoint that is presented. If you have any questions at all related to the series, just email us at yff@yale.edu. Finally, now let me introduce today's speaker. We're so happy to have Keith Pluymers with us. Keith is Associate Professor of History at Illinois State University, where he teaches courses on early modern Europe and environmental history. His first book, No Wood, No Kingdom, Political Ecology in the English Atlantic, available through University of Pennsylvania Press, published in 2021, explores the relationship between fears of wood scarcity and English colonial expansion. That book has won the Ben Snow Prize from the North American Conference on British Studies. Congratulations on that, Keith. And now I'm very happy to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm just going to take a moment to share my slides with you all. All right. Thank you very much for that introduction, Gary, and thank you to the invitation from everyone involved in this series. It is an incredible honor to be with you all. In a lot of ways, I've got tasked with something impossible today, which is to start off a conversation about the origins of scientific forestry. And whenever you spend time with historians, you know that every historian's worst nightmare is to explain when something begins. So into the nightmare for me today. In order to try to do this, I'm going to start us off with a really broad and at least somewhat inaccurate, deliberately so, definition of what scientific forestry might be. I would ask everyone here today to really think, as in particular the next two speakers in this series are going to be speaking to you about other potential different origin points than the one I'm going to offer you today. I'm going to start off with what I see as a series of crucial developments that take place in England over the 15th to 17th centuries, namely a shift from the management of forests for multiple uses, grounded mostly in elite hunting, though not exclusively, to the creation of new forest bureaucracies and forest officers tasked with creating quantitative assessments of forests as resources, mostly for timber and for fuel, and attempts to predict and define what the exploitation of those resources could look like in order to generate a supply of those forest products into what they called posterity and what we might anachronistically call a kind of sustainable yield. That's a bit provocative for people working in my field, but at least for our purposes today, I think it's a good way for us to try to think about what a potential origin point might be. Over the course of what I'm going to do today, I'm going to start off by trying to give us a sense of how forests were functioning in England through the medieval period and where the change begins to happen during the early modern period. From there, I want to talk about how some of those changes in forestry practice led to fears about scarcity and successive wood crises over those points in time, as well as the goal of managing woods to have a perpetual supply. After laying the groundwork of what's happening in England, I want to think about how this starts to move outwards with England's colonial expansion into the wider Atlantic world, starting with Ireland and with some efforts to manage forests, failed efforts to manage forests in 16th and 17th century Ireland, to an example of deforestation and then rather rapid deforestation or reforestation within a 100-year period in Bermuda, to thinking about the vision of forestry coming from John Evelyn, whose book Silva was the very first book published by the Royal Society, in many ways seen as a foundational figure in what we could call big science or national science. And it's notable that the first work they published was focused on forestry. So thinking about what his vision was, where it was looking domestically, and what role, if any, empire was meant to play. And then to conclude, I want us to think, in keeping with the webinar's larger themes, about how any of this makes it to North America. And to do so, I'm going to have us think about a man named Edward Randolph and about the 1691 reissued charter for Massachusetts Bay. So let's get started. In forest histories of England, a good starting point is usually the Norman conquest of the 12th century. When William the Conqueror came over, along with the Normans, and successfully took over the realm of England, moved quickly into Wales as well, one of the things that came with him was a series of laws that were designed to set aside specific grounds for elite hunting. Out of that origin in elite hunting, we see statutes, we see the Charter of the Forest in England, we see the creation of special courts and court officers with roles in enforcement that govern lands that are going to be called forests. Now, a medieval English forest is really quite a diverse thing. It includes standing trees. It also includes brushlands or pasture. And in part, this is because it's really designed around the preservation of elite hunting grounds, mostly for deer, but also for other species as well. And over the course of the medieval period in England, we'll see the elaboration and expansion of what are called the forest laws that lead to a series of customs and regulations for how a forest is governed. This often could be quite complicated, and the goal behind it is really to treat the forest as a site in which multiple uses of the forest can cohabit in a harmonious manner. So you have elite hunting, you have occasional extraction from woodlands for timber, sometimes for ship timber, sometimes for elite construction products. You also have efforts to manage the forests as commons for everyday people who are dwelling in or around the forests. In the image depicted here, which comes from a calendar and prayer book from 14th century Toulouse, we see an illumination depicting what is called pannage, or the seasonal right of people to let loose their pigs in the forest to feed on oak acorns and on beech mast and to fatten up. And this is one of the many common rights that were bound up with forests. In England, these were often known as the boots. So you have things like houseboot, the ability to go and gather wood or wood byproducts for house construction in a forest; fire boot, which was the right to go and gather fuel with particular restrictions for personal use within the forest. And this is really the pattern that is going to be critical throughout the medieval period. Multiple users, multiple uses, and the idea of making it all work. You have this body of statutes, the forest laws, that are designed to balance all of these uses, but they have their origin point in the preservation of hunting grounds. That doesn't mean that there were never points of friction. That does not mean that medieval English monarchs did not periodically attempt to use royal forests for things like timber production, but they were doing so within a legal and regulatory framework that was grounded in these forest laws. The forest laws are going to remain something really important going into the early modern period. Indeed, when I begin to talk about reformers as we get further along, a lot of those reformers will end up drawing on forest laws. One of the things that I argue in my book, indeed, is that when Charles I revives the forest laws in the 1630s, something incredibly controversial that helped in no small way to contribute to the kickoff of England's Civil War in the 1640s, that he was doing so in part because he saw the revival and selective application of some of these old laws as a vehicle to advance new goals for managing royal forests as timber-producing resources and as sites of what we might anachronistically call critical strategic materials, particularly masts and timber for the construction of naval vessels. So the forest laws will remain important throughout this period, but there's going to need to be, for the creation of some of the efforts at measurement and prediction, a challenge of the old forest bureaucracy that takes place. This really begins with a wider set of bureaucratic reforms, beginning with the first Tudor monarchs in England, Henry VII, and in the case of forests, really Henry VIII. Under Henry's daughter, Elizabeth, you're going to see a further intensification with a series of surveys of all royal forests taking place over the 1560s and again in the 1580s. One of these surveys is on display here from Roger Taverner. Taverner and his son would both be behind some of the biggest surveys that take place during Elizabeth's reign. And these surveys represent something new in forestry practice in early modern England, namely the attempt to systematically quantify what resources are in a forest. Doing that quantification leads to a shift in defining what a forest is, though. It may be a bit difficult to read here, but in these surveys, the number of valuable species are narrowed down, most often to oak and beech, though as you can see on page 62 for Woodstock Park on the left, there is a reference to maple there. That is relatively rare. For the most part, what is being measured is what are called serviceable or timber oaks, occasionally beech. And then the other thing being measured is coppices. And in a group of foresters, I assume everyone knows this, but at this point in time, coppices are areas of felled hardwood trees that are allowed to regenerate from the stumps in order to produce a lot of new shoots that can be felled on a roughly 15 to 18 year cycle in order to produce reliable supplies of fuel, small construction material, and the like. Surveys like this, as they're taking place in the 16th century and then again in the 17th century, are going to attempt to define what is valuable in a forest. And that act of definition in itself represents a significant shift from the old harmonious multiple use model in the past. As many of us know, what is measured is what is counted in the sense of being valued, and that is the case here as well. Suddenly, the forest as a whole, as it was defined and enshrined in law by some of the old forest bureaucracy, is becoming less important than whether or not there are appropriate or safe numbers of timber oaks, beech, and coppices to be used for fuel. Following along with these forests, we also see a series of new bureaucratic instruments being introduced. So with some of these surveyors are coming new commissioners, special commissions that are sent out by the Office of the Exchequer in England. And for those of us who are Americans, the Exchequer is a kind of rough equivalent to our Department of the Treasury. It's in charge of financial and budgetary matters for the Crown. The Exchequer is sending out special commissions to do surveys, but also to investigate what they are going to increasingly define as the abuses of traditional foresters and the traditional forest bureaucracy. A lot of this is going to follow on from the surveys, but you're going to see depositions, occasional bits of impeachment or trials, including of people working within the old forest bureaucracy for practicing traditional practices, such as cutting browse from trees for deer, taking other actions to protect forests as grounds of hunting, but that are perceived to damage trees that would be useful for timber. Pollarding is one of the offenses that these new commissions are going to define. And so these special commissions, the surveyors that come with them, are going to start to redefine what a forest means. This is not without controversy. I have a great petition from one of the old forest bureaucracy in the 17th century protesting against these reforms and claiming that the new system will destroy the very face of the forest. The old forest bureaucracy articulated what they did as a form of maintaining beauty. They use the language of aesthetics quite often, whereas the new forest bureaucracy and these surveyors are going to use the language of numbers and of quantification in order to explain what a forest is and what it is supposed to do. The efforts coming out of this wave of surveys and commissions, in addition to redefining what a forest is and what a resource is, what a forest is for, are going to produce a wave of panics. Basically, every time there's a survey, there is a group of people who say there aren't enough oaks or beech or coppices in order to supply the Navy, produce a sufficient supply of forest wood for people firewood for people dwelling in and around forests, and that this is a problem that needs to be rectified. One of the first people to take this on in print is Arthur Standish in his New Directions of Experience to the Commons Complaint, something that is usually abbreviated as the Commons Complaint. Standish is an absolutely fascinating figure. If you haven't read him, I highly recommend reading him. He calls for a mass reforestation plan throughout England. He comes up with ways to use marginal grounds and hedges to plant different types of trees. He comes up with some ideas for shade-grown agriculture, or what we might call agroforestry, as a way of balancing the need to produce increasing amounts of food with the goal of producing increasing amounts of trees. So a fascinating individual. But you see huge records of concern about running out of forest, beginning in the 1560s and then through the 1580s, following on these surveys from the Taverners, and then continuing through the 17th century. Someone like Standish is notable because it takes place in print, but you have a much higher volume of these taking place in letters and occasionally in government records in England. Most of these are in manuscript, so it can often be excluded or invisible from more modern scholars looking back on these. But when we dive into these records, we see a kind of constant circulating concern about what exactly is happening with the woods in England. Is there scarcity? Is something running out? One of the important things for us to note here is that scarcity is going to be something that is constructed. The concerns about scarcity don't necessarily reflect an absolute decline in the number of trees. In many cases, they reflect friction between user groups. For example, naval ship carpenters are going to be in constant fights with every single other forest user because they have a very specific set of needs, specifically what they call elbow timber, which in the era prior to the ability to bend wooden boards using steam for shipbuilding, they went out and looked for trees that naturally bent in appropriate manners to construct a ship. And as a result, they had different timelines, different tree types and tree shapes than other forest users, which led to conflict between some of these user groups. In a number of other cases, particularly as we start to see measurement and quantification, there are attempts to figure out what a market for timber and firewood looks like for what had previously been non-market goods. This market is incredibly poorly defined, and that leads to pretty constant conflict over whether scarcity means an absolute lack of trees or whether it just means that the trees that are available are too expensive to haul to the places where people need them. All of this is going to trigger proposals like Standish, but also a number of private ones to produce woodlands that will be able to create a supply not just for the present, but for posterity. And posterity is the word they use constantly. Posterity for early modern English people means all succeeding future generations. So they really are thinking long term. In things like questionnaires that are going out to people living in forests or to forest officials, you occasionally get questions like, if we fell 4 acres per year for timber, will we be able to maintain a supply in posterity? And that gets at the ambition here that we're seeing, and really what I see as the emergence of some of the key features that will show up in forestry practices later on that to us feel scientific or modern. The question then is, what does this mean in England? For someone like Standish, this meant a program of domestic forestry reform. But before Standish, and at nearly the same moment as these surveys are being produced, England is also engaged in a project of colonial expansion, beginning with Ireland in the 1560s, and very quickly following with transatlantic programs of expansion with Roanoke in the 1580s, with Greenland, Newfoundland, with Jamestown, with New England, a wide range of colonial projects in the 16th and 17th centuries. And when you look at the records of the people promoting these colonial projects, they really consistently mention that their new colony will likely have the ability to address concerns about wood scarcity in England by providing a cheap and inexhaustible supply of timber. In practice, despite these claims that colonies were going to produce an endless supply of timber, the reality was far more complicated. In Ireland, despite those claims, the colonial government gives away basically all of the timbered land without regulating it like a royal forest, which means it goes into private hands. A few decades later, that same colonial government will be complaining that there's a wood scarcity in Ireland. What they mean by that is that the crown doesn't have access to woods, and that some of the particular settlers having something that was initially deemed of little to no value, discovered that, in fact, trees had quite a bit of value and that they wanted to sell it to the crown at a very high cost. These complaints about the waste and scarcity of woods in Ireland have led a number of people to assume that colonists were always extractive and disruptive, essentially asset stripping out their newly colonized land. In practice, the reality is a bit more complicated. What we see in the personal papers of colonists like Richard Boyle, who's the first Earl of Cork, is efforts to bring a number of the new forestry techniques being pioneered in England's royal forests into his own private lands in Ireland. He'll designate areas to be managed as coppices to create a reliable supply of fuel, mostly for his ironworks, over a long period of time. He'll create forest officers that he calls his wood reeves or wood sheriffs to make sure that tenants living on his lands are not illegally felling or otherwise damaging trees. He'll mark timber throughout the forests in order to indicate which trees are available for cutting and which ones are not. So we see a number of these practices show up among private landholders, but there's a conflict and there's a real gap between what the English colonial state wants to do in Ireland and what private settlers are up to. One of the other places that we see something that looks a lot like a form of conservation forestry in the 17th century is Bermuda, which was known as the Summer Islands throughout the time. Throughout the 17th century, the Summer Islands were managed by a joint stock company, the Summer Islands Company. From fairly early on, there was a lot of writing about trees there. Although Bermuda was generally not seen as a place that could alleviate English wood scarcity, there was a lot of writing about valuable trees there, particularly the Bermuda cedar or Juniperus bermudiana, which was seen as valuable for luxury furniture construction, occasionally luxury building. It's used in at least a few churches and rooms in elite houses, mostly for its pest-resistant qualities. But there's a lot of writing about wood early on, and about 10 years after the initial English settlement in Bermuda, there's a series of laws passed that are designed to preserve and call for the replanting of trees throughout the islands. This is not just for timber production. There's an understanding that trees serve an important purpose as windbreaks to protect agriculture. There's a concern with multiple uses. Over the course of the 17th century, this becomes so extensive that after an initial phase of deforestation for agriculture, particularly for the planting of tobacco, you have a movement towards reforestation, particularly with those Bermuda cedars, that will ultimately allow Bermuda to become a hub of shipbuilding and maritime repairs in the later 17th and 18th centuries. And that's a deliberate action to replant forests. So what we see in Bermuda really is something quite important where colonialism doesn't just lead automatically to the destruction of woodland resources, but it leads to a transformation of what forested landscapes look like, to select for specific tree species that are bound up with specific uses, and then to design a system of regulation and enforcement that will protect the cultivation of those tree species, including through replanting, something that really doesn't happen in England in any large-scale manner. All of which takes us to John Evelyn. I start off by talking about what happens before Evelyn, because Evelyn is a famous figure in English forestry. His Silva, which is the first book published by the Royal Society, the Scientific Society, created by Charles II upon the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, is going to become a massive text that is seen as both sounding the alarm on wood scarcity in England and delivering an agenda for reforestation. The precipitating event that led to the authorship of Silva was a request before the Royal Society from the Royal Navy, asking about how to generate reliable supplies of ship timber in royal forests. In the book itself, Evelyn goes a different way. in part because he's trying to settle grudges from the English Civil War. He thinks that most royal forests have been completely defaced and destroyed. That's a little bit true and a little bit not at the exact same time. But he really focuses on having private large landholders engage in mass private forestry as a solution to what are perceived as national and even national security problems. Ultimately, though, Evelyn is focused on England as a place that can produce a self-sustaining supply of woods and forests for posterity. That word again. Evelyn has almost nothing to say about what is happening in any of England's colonies, despite being in regular correspondence with people such as the governor of Virginia, who engaged in some efforts to manage and regulate that colony's forests that Evelyn would have known about. Evelyn has nothing to say about Ireland, except for referencing one special tree there that he believes its presence in Ireland means it can be grown in England. He says almost nothing about the Caribbean and says nothing about empire except when he republishes some letters and correspondence from John Winthrop Jr. regarding forestry in New England that mostly focuses on pitch and tar manufacturing. In those sections, Evelyn really waffles on what role, if any, North American colonies should play in imperial forestry at all. He'll say at one point that, in fact, it will be good for New England colonists to engage in a program of destruction and clearance of forests as far west as they can go as part of a program of planting a new, primarily agricultural settlement in the Americas, bringing glory to King Charles II and to England's empire more broadly. In at least a few other cases, Evelyn does seem to think that perhaps managing colonial forests might be a bit of a good idea in order to relieve pressure on England's forests, but he ultimately kind of dumps that despite floating it. So in this foundational text that is often cited as a sort of early and crucial forestry manual, you have someone who advocates in a number of places for what would be seen as careless and extractive forestry with no goal of future returns out of North America in order to satisfy other imperial aims. So how does imperial forestry ultimately come to North America? Aside from some scattered efforts from towns in New England to regulate and preserve forests as commons for their community, and a couple of attempts from Massachusetts Bay in the 1640s to regulate who has access to woodlands along the frontier in order to supply a proposed iron forge that would be built at Braintree. Most efforts are local. They're happening at the level of New England towns, rather really at a significant level than from the colony. And even what the colony is doing is really not seeing significant oversight from London in any particular way. Instead, it's going to be really down to one, at least according to contemporary colonists, really annoying individual named Edward Randolph, who first comes to Massachusetts in the 1670s and immediately begins writing letters back to the Board of Trade and Plantations in England, complaining about the waste of woods. He wants to reorient New England's economy in order to be useful to empire, not necessarily as useful to the colonists living there. And his vision for doing so is going to turn in many ways on the production of specific wood products, both very large masts that will be used by the Navy, but also other timber supplies that would be shipped with a subsidy back to England in order to avoid any perceived threat of scarcity. Randolph is going to engage in a highly combative and conflictual campaign with colonial authorities over who has access to woods in the colonies. He will do studies of woodlands, engage in the process of building surveys, running from Massachusetts to Maine, and in them he will consistently complain that the best timber has already been felled and that there is a scarcity in what was supposed to be a land of abundance. Ultimately, Randolph's constant missives back to London are going to see some imperial action, namely some clauses in the Massachusetts Bay Charter of 1691 that set aside trees over a certain diameter to the crown. What will follow on from this is what are known as the White Pine Acts in the 18th century, in which a number of trees are marked with the king's broad arrow, setting aside these as the exclusive property of the crown, and in many cases, particularly of the Navy. These acts are incredibly controversial. They run roughshod over local forms of forest management and regulation, some of which had drawn on the techniques of improved forestry coming out of those 16th and 17th century forest reforms in England. They will, on the eve of the American Revolution, lead to something called the White Pine Riots, on which the historian Strother Roberts has written a number of really wonderful things. But you see only over 100 years after the first English colonial settlements in the Americas and in North America, particularly anything approaching a system of imperial forestry in which there is the state-driven definition of certain trees as resources, the regulation and marking of those trees, systematic efforts to conduct surveys to find out where they are, and then the creation of laws and enforcement mechanisms to protect those. In the interest of getting us to ultimately be able to have a bit of a discussion in the 10 minutes or so that we have remaining about this, I just want to conclude by hopefully zooming out for a second and thinking about what the story I told today means for thinking about scientific forestry in North America, the ultimate aim of this series. We see a lot of reforms in England, and you will see at least some similar reforms with new bureaucracies managing forests in France when you get to a wonderful, really truly wonderful later speaker in this webinar series. So there's going to be similar patterns of regulating forests in a number of European countries emerging at roughly the same points in time. The degree to which any of those actually shape interaction with forests in colonial settings is going to be hit or miss. You have a number of individuals, whether they are people in towns. The historian Brian Donahue has written about woodland conservation in Concord, for example, that you could see in the regulation of forests as commons. So you see systems of regulation and management that show both resource thinking and older techniques of managing as commons being brought to bear. But the ways in which those are bound up with networks of big science, the formation of a regulatory state, with efforts to manage things as natural resources or critical strategic resources, as forests will be treated in England, is something that's going to come late to the Americas. And when it comes to North America, particularly to English North America, it will come with a whole lot of controversy and conflict. I thank you all very much for being here with me today, and I'm very happy to answer whatever questions you might have.
Keith, thank you so much. That was great. What a great way to start off the series in such a comprehensive overview, but also a lot of detail there. So thanks so much for that. Just to remind folks, we have a lot of questions. We'll see, Keith, how many we can get through. Let's see if we can go quickly. And then I just need a minute or two to wrap up at the end. So jumping in, Josh asks the following. I'm fascinated by the idea of manufactured scarcity in early England. There are so many residences in the early colonial period in the US, as well as the progressive era and our current moment. I'm curious about how you see this concept of manufactured scarcity interacting with carbon crediting schemes in the present. That's a
Yeah,
big
I mean, that's a really wonderful question. And I think it really pays for us to generally zoom out whenever we can. And we think about scarcity and think about what it is, in that it's always going to be something that is defined in different ways by different people. Um, and when we try to disentangle how different either forest users or political interest groups or other people are going to define what either abundance or scarcity of a resource means, what a resource is, that's going to help us to understand what's going on in any of these cases. And that's very much the case in early modern England. There you see conflicts between kind of the most frequent ones are between naval ship carpenters and people who are granted royal charters to build ironworks in the forest. The ironworkers want basically the entire forest to become a place that they can turn into a charcoal manufactory that they're going to manage on regular felling cycles. And the ship carpenters are thinking in much longer term cycles, often 50 to 100-year growth cycles for oaks in particular.
okay.
I think as we get to carbon capture and where that factors in, again, the question is what are the different user groups at play, and how do we really take seriously all of the different interests involved when we think about what scarcity means?
Great, thanks, Keith. Doug asks the following question. Can you reflect upon the implications of the 1493 doctrine of discovery on forestry? In British Columbia, this doctrine results in problematic and detrimental activities and attitudes.
Yeah, so I mean, what's really interesting in a number of later cases, the doctrine of discovery is going to become really important. Um, there's there's not a lot of reference to it in some of these early colonial records that are being produced. They mostly just say there's an infinite store of trees, we can cut them inexhaustibly. They make little to no mention of any native claim or rights, or even when they make reference to the really robust patterns of forest management that native peoples are engaged in, from the use of fire being the most prominent. They often just kind of remark that there's a lot of fire, but they don't ever really think about why or what impact that might have on things like forest morphology. It's really kind of remarkable how much, at least at this early date, English sources are mostly concerned about explaining why in North America and the Caribbean, they're allowed to take something and that the Spanish don't have a claim to it. They don't even really get around to justifying why they should be entitled to steal things from native peoples until honestly much later in the colonial process. It's as though it doesn't occur to them that they need to justify um, things that they're going to do very violently, and they will talk about the violence they engage in, but they won't go to the trouble of cooking up a justification until later on.
Thanks, Keith. Um, James asks you or comments you talked about Bermuda cedar being used extensively in early colonial days. Do you have any other examples of tree species that were highly sought after for shipbuilding or construction?
For shipbuilding and construction, it's going to be mostly a focus on they will often describe things as oak, and in part, this is where from the perspective of foresters and forestry, getting into some of these early surveys is really fascinating because they're it's incredibly frustrating to figure out what trees they're actually talking about. Sometimes they will just say good timber, and they won't tell you what trees that is at all.
Mm.
Sometimes they'll say oak, but they're not really clear on what exactly they mean. We have examples. There's a wonderful tract, an early history of Barbados from a man named Richard Ligon, who has this incredible catalog of native trees and their diverse uses. Everything from making dyes to hardwoods that are used in furniture manufacturing to what might be good to resist insect predation on ships in the Caribbean, which is seen as a distinctive problem from elsewhere. Some of those trees, particularly things like fustic and mastic, are going to turn into dyewood supplies that are going to be exported. But in a lot of cases, you just get these incredibly vague descriptions of timber, which makes it hard to figure out if they are doing species thinking in any way whatsoever.
Let's see if we can squeeze in two more. Although these might not be quick answers. Brian asks, is there a different management practice in large forests versus small community-based forests?
Based on the records, and in England, a lot of the records we have are coming out of royal forests, which are distinctive
Right.
from woodlands on private, including elite private land holdings, which were sometimes bigger in scale than some small royal forests.
Mm.
It's mostly the same things in royal forests, in the largest royal forests and the ones that were deemed critical to either royal ironworks or royal shipbuilding. Essentially, what you see is the most vigorous enforcement. Occasionally, and this is where a kind of hard shift from kind of legal multi-use management to natural resource sustained yield or scientific management, it's really fuzzy. Um, James and Charles, but particularly James the First, really likes hunting. So he will designate some of his forests and say, manage them so I can go hunt deer.
Mm.
And in others, he will say, manage them to produce as much wood or iron as is possible while ensuring that posterity is protected. So some of the difference in use doesn't come down to scale or size, but to the particular habits and preferences of an individual monarch, which were idiosyncratic in a lot of ways.
Okay. Let's see if we can get to this one, but this is a big question. What effect did forestry laws and regulations influence the American Revolution?
I mean, this is a really huge question. If you look in some of the 18th century complaints about what tyrannical British rule meant, if you look at things like the White Pine riots, and I'd really recommend Strother Roberts' work on this, it's excellent. Essentially, you see forestry practice as just another field in which you have friction between local interests, local economic interests, local desires for political control, including over natural resources, and the goals of imperial managers and of the empire more broadly. So I think as we're thinking about the American Revolution and about forestry practice, it's useful to think about forestry as yet another realm in which there is a contest between how should resources be managed? Should they be managed for local benefit and by local people, or should they be managed for imperial benefit by people at the imperial center?
Great. All right. With that, Keith, again, thank you so much for the presentation. I think it was a great way to kick off the series. Yeah, a lot more to expand on, and we will touch on more of these themes in the future, but thank you for starting this off for us. Really
Thank you
appreciate
again for having me. It was wonderful.
it. Awesome. All right, couple wrap-up items for me. As always, as a reminder, the recordings for the presentation will be available on the Yale Forest Forum website in a couple days. We need to take that time to make sure we have very accurate captions and make sure that these Videos are accessible to everybody. Slides will also be made available, and there will be a list of reference documents and readings on the Air Force One website under Keith's bio. So please check that. Next week, so continue to join us on this series. Again, Thursdays from 12 to 1, all through the fall. Next week, we'll hear from Kieko Matson. Kieko is Associate Professor and Department Chair of the Department of History at the University of Hawaii Manoa campus. She'll talk with us about wood famine and the development of state forestry in early modern France.